The evening their daughter vanished was supposed to be ordinary. A calm Thursday, the kind where nothing dramatic ever happens. At least that's what Donald and Catherine Smith believed as they watched Kimberly color on the living room floor. The sun outside was soft and golden, casting warm light across Kimberly's tiny hands as she carefully filled in a picture of a cartoon butterfly. She asked if she could play in the yard for just 5 minutes. Catherine hesitated but eventually agreed. Kimberly slipped on her shoes, grabbed her favorite stuffed animal, and ran outside with a giggle. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Catherine glanced out again, and froze. The yard was empty. She stepped outside, calling her name lightly, expecting the little girl to peek out. But there was no giggle, no footsteps, no movement. Donald joined her search, checking the back fence, the garden, the shed. Each second stretched longer, heavier. Kimberly's favorite stuffed animal lay near the back gate, face down in the grass. That's when panic hit. Within minutes, police cars lined the street. A K-9 unit arrived. Willie, a powerful German shepherd in his tactical vest, was brought in by Officer Jeremy. Willie sniffed Kimberly's stuffed animal, pulled forward with determination into the woods behind the home, and followed a trail deep into the trees. But suddenly, Willie stopped, circled, and lost the scent. Just like that, the trail died, and so did the last certainty Donald and Catherine had left. For 3 agonizing days, they lived the same nightmare. But on the 3rd night, something utterly strange happened. At exactly 8:05 p.m., a loud scratching noise echoed at their living room window. When Donald rushed forward, he froze. A police dog, the K-9 Willie, stood outside, paws pressed against the glass, eyes locked with unnerving, desperate intensity. He didn't bark. He just stared, wearing his heavy tactical vest, trying to tell them a secret. Willie returned the next day, and the next, tapping, scratching, pleading. When the full terrifying truth came out, Donald and Catherine would turn pale and wish they had listened sooner. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, a deafening drumbeat measuring the time since Kimberly vanished. 3 days had not dulled the edges of the nightmare, only sharpened the pain into a constant, hollow ache. Donald sat rigidly on the sofa, his once firm shoulders slumped in defeat, while Catherine, propelled by nervous energy and gnawing guilt, paced the worn rug of the living room. The police had officially withdrawn the heavy search teams, leaving the house unnervingly quiet, a silence broken only by their own strained breathing. Hope was no longer a fire, it was a memory. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and unwashed grief. Donald had just started trying to convince Catherine to attempt sleep when, precisely at 8:05 p.m., a sharp, metallic scratching erupted from the front window, the undeniable sound of powerful claws against the glass. Donald shot up, a forgotten surge of adrenaline momentarily clearing the fog of despair. He yanked the thick curtains back, ready to shout at whatever intrusive noise had dared to violate their sorrow. He didn't shout. He froze. Outside, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the porch light, stood Willie, the K-9. The massive German shepherd, wearing his bulky, black tactical vest, was half standing on the window ledge, his forepaws pressing firmly against the glass. He wasn't aggressive, but his intense eyes that had seemed empty during the failed search, were now locked onto the living room with an unnerving, desperate clarity. He tapped, once, twice, a gentle yet insistent rhythm that felt less like an animal trying to get in and more like a human trying to communicate a vital code. Donald could feel the blood draining from his face, leaving him cold. This wasn't a stray dog or a stress reaction, this was the same K-9 who had lost the scent, now returning to them. Catherine rushed to his side, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. "Why is he here? What does he want?" She whispered, her voice cracking with a terrifying, new possibility. Before they could react, a frantic police SUV skidded to a stop on their lawn. Officer Jeremy stumbled out, looking haggard and profoundly embarrassed. "I am so sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Smith," Jeremy muttered, rushing toward the dog. "I can't explain it. He tore through his reinforced kennel tonight. He hasn't left the station since we officially stood down the search." Willie ignored Jeremy completely, his rigid posture unbroken, his gaze fixed solely on Catherine, his tail low but thumping a steady, heavy beat against the pavement. Jeremy finally managed to wrestle the powerful dog away, securing the heavy leash and driving away with a barrage of apologies and empty promises. Donald slumped back onto the sofa, but Catherine remained by the window, staring into the space Willie had just occupied. The lingering image of the desperate dog in his tactical vest, silently tapping, felt like a message they had been given but utterly failed to comprehend. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with the dog's unmet plea. The next day was spent in a suffocating quiet, punctuated only by Catherine's silent pacing and Donald's attempts to call the precinct. "Officer." Jeremy assured them, again, that Willie was secured, monitored, and would not escape. Yet, as the living room clock crept toward the 8 o'clock hour, Catherine found herself standing by the window, her body trembling not from cold, but from expectation. Donald watched her, a look of pity and fear twisting his features. He saw a woman cracking under the strain, finding false hope in a rogue animal. Catherine saw a husband retreating into denial, refusing to accept that the official, logical world had failed them. The hands hit 8:05 p.m. And the sound returned, more urgent, louder this time: scratch. Tap. Slam. Willie was back, and he was working feverishly at the glass, his snout leaving a visible streak of condensation. Jeremy arrived seconds later, his face pale with frustration and shame. He had clearly run all the way from the car. "I swear, I don't know how he's doing this," Jeremy gasped, wrestling with the dog. "We sedated him lightly tonight. He's overriding the dosage." The tapping that night was frantic, the paws hammering against the glass as if trying to break the invisible barrier that separated the dog's terrible knowledge from the Smith's ignorant grief. This was not a random escape, this was a purposeful, calculated mission. Catherine watched Willie's eyes, they weren't angry or aggressive, but wide with an unrelenting focus, the focus of a warrior who knew the fight wasn't over. The nightly spectacle cemented itself as a tormenting ritual. Every evening at 8:05, Willie was there. Catherine began to meticulously track his actions, desperate to find a pattern. Sometimes he would scratch low, near the floor, other nights, high on the glass, almost like he was pointing. He never barked aggressively, only whining softly, a low, pleading sound that clawed at Catherine's heart as Jeremy dragged him away. The routine was driving the Smiths to the brink of their relationship. "He's just reflecting our anxiety, Kath. He's a trauma dog." Donald insisted, clinging desperately to rational explanations, because the alternative, that a dog knew where their daughter was and they were too dense to understand, was unbearable. But Catherine was resolute. "Willie is telling us something," she argued, her voice raw. She felt the crushing weight of guilt daily, the thought that the 5 minutes she allowed Kimberly outside had led to this. Now, the dog's routine felt directed at her, accusing her failure to listen. Willie wasn't stressed. He was a lifeline. He showed the police the trail died, but he's here now. He found a new one, or he knows where the old one ended. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass where Willie's nose had been. The dog's relentless, patterned desperation was the only thing preventing her from collapsing into final, irreversible despair, but the terrifying message remained maddeningly just out of reach. She knew that if she didn't break this code, they would lose their daughter forever. The nightly vigil continued, stretching the Smiths' sanity threadbare. By the 5th night, Willie was operating on a level of focused desperation that bordered on mystical. Jeremy had resorted to confining the dog in a reinforced, triple-locked metal enclosure at the precinct, yet Willie still managed to appear at the window at 8:05 p.m., his mud-caked paws marking his determined journey. But this time, the display escalated beyond simple tapping. After a few rounds of urgent, silent tapping, Willie disappeared momentarily from the light of the porch. When he returned, he was holding something carefully, almost tenderly, in his jaws. He dropped it onto the welcome mat and resumed his position, tapping insistently until Jeremy's inevitable, frantic arrival. Donald rushed to the door the instant Jeremy pulled away with the dog. He snatched up the object and his breath hitched. It was a small, tattered piece of pink cloth. It was unmistakably a fragment of Kimberly's favorite blanket, the one she dragged everywhere and always slept with. The sight of it sent a jolt of sickening realization through Catherine. This wasn't random debris, this was proof. He's tracking her. He found it somewhere and brought it back to us, she cried, collapsing onto the mat, clutching the faded pink scrap. Donald immediately called the precinct captain, his voice tight with desperate urgency. He demanded they dispatch a unit to search the perimeter Willie had been using to approach their house. But bureaucracy, cold and unyielding, met his pleas. "Mr. Smith, I understand the emotional weight of this," the captain stated over the phone, his tone professional and distant. "But that cloth is highly mobile. It could have blown from anywhere. We cannot dedicate resources to a search based on a single K-9 escaping its security due to stress." Crushed, Donald hung up. But the police's dismissiveness was shattered the following morning. Willie hadn't waited for 8:05. Before dawn, Jeremy found the dog waiting patiently by their front door, with a new offering. He had dropped a small, green shoelace onto the welcome mat, one of the new laces Catherine had recently bought for Kimberly's sneakers. The lace had a specific not only Kimberly used. This was irrefutable, undeniable evidence. Willie had tracked the scent, found a discarded item, and, having failed to convince the police, had bypassed them entirely to deliver the proof to the only people who mattered. Donald, fueled by a terrifying surge of hope and white-hot anger, drove to the precinct, throwing the evidence onto the captain's desk. "This dog is risking his career and his life to tell you the trail isn't dead, and you are dismissing it as stress," he shouted. He demanded Willie be brought back to the field immediately. But the captain held firm. The evidence was too circumstantial to justify a shift in strategy, especially when it might lead them into a confrontation with the suspected culprit, Killer Wani. Donald left the station defeated, his hope dashed by the cold wall of institutional failure. The dog was their only key, and now the door to action was locked. The police's rejection was the final, crippling blow for Donald, who retreated into bitter, silent resignation. He sat in the kitchen, staring into a cold cup of coffee, paralyzed by the enormity of the failure. But for Catherine, that institutional failure sharpened her despair into a burning, fierce resolve. If the professional world refused to see, then she had to trust the primal source of the message. Willie was communicating, and the police couldn't decipher it. Therefore, she had to be the one to complete the mission. That evening, the familiar tension tightened the air as the clock approached 8:05. This time, however, Willie didn't wait outside. Officer Jeremy must have been tragically mistaken about the security of the yard gate, because just before the appointed hour, a sharp, splintering crash echoed from the back of the house. Willie had forced his way through the poorly secured rear door. He was inside. Donald shouted in a mixture of fear and panic, jumping up, ready to defend his home from the aggressive animal the police had described. But Willie wasn't aggressive. He raced through the house, ignoring Donald's shouts and ignoring the obvious sense of the family. He ran directly toward the back hallway and halted at the threshold of Kimberly's empty bedroom. He didn't tear anything up or frantically sniff the floor. He simply stood there, his large silhouette framed by the dim light, a silent, profound witness to the absence. Then, he let out a long, mournful, heart-wrenching whine, a sound of devastating loss and desperation that wrung the air from Catherine's lungs. It was a sound that spoke not of an animal tracking a target, but of a loyal protector grieving a missing friend. He turned and ran back to the living room, stopping directly in front of Catherine. He nudged her hand gently, his head low, then deliberately placed his large, muddy paws onto the clean glass of the television screen. He looked past Donald, his entire being focused on Catherine, demanding her full, unbroken attention. The unspoken communication reached a crescendo when he issued a single, loud, short bark, not a threat, but a decisive command. Listen to me. Stop pitying yourself. Act. In that moment, Catherine understood. Willie wasn't just bringing clues. He was demanding that she overcome her crippling self-blame to see what the rational world had dismissed. The dog was telling her that this mission was hers, and hers alone. She finally met his intense gaze, her tears drying, replaced by a cold, desperate certainty. She was no longer a victim, she was the recipient of an extraordinary, nonverbal plea for help, and she realized she would follow this dog anywhere. The morning after Willie's forceful entry into their home marked a tipping point for Catherine. Donald was still reeling from the dog's calculated intrusion, insisting that the animal needed to be contained before he did real damage. But Catherine had seen the look in Willie's eyes, heard the sound of the dog's sorrowful whine in Kimberly's room, and felt the demanding nudge against her hand. She knew the logic of the police and her husband was irrelevant now. She spent the entire day consumed by the memory of the dog's actions, waiting with a quiet, desperate focus she hadn't felt since Kimberly disappeared. That evening, she didn't wait in the living room, she was already standing on the front porch, wrapped in a thick coat, ready. Precisely at 8:05 p.m., the familiar, powerful figure of Willie emerged from the shadows of the nearby woods. He ran straight toward Catherine, stopping directly at the glass storm door. The usual tapping began, but tonight, Willie's paws were coated in heavy, dark mud from a fresh rainfall. His actions were different, less frantic, more deliberate. He reared up, bracing himself against the door, and used his muddy forepaw to drag a heavy streak down the glass. Then he lifted the paw, paused, and dragged another long, slanting streak parallel to the first. He hesitated, looking intensely into Catherine's eyes, then moved his paw, and made a single, sharp downward swipe perpendicular to the others. 2 lines. Pause. 1 line. Catherine stared, mesmerized. She wasn't seeing random dirt, she was seeing a drawing, a symbol. It was crude, primal, but clear, a directional message. Donald, drawn outside by the dog's strange silence, saw the pattern too. It's just mud, Kath, the angle of his paw, he whispered, trying to pull her away. But Catherine shook her head, tears of fierce realization streaming down her face. No, Donald. Look. 2, then 1. It's a map. 2 of something, then 1 of something else. He's showing us a path. Willie nudged the glass with his nose and backed away, waiting for them to understand. The pattern held, 2 slanting lines, a definite pause, and 1 decisive line. Before they could debate the meaning further, Officer Jeremy arrived, his siren thankfully silent this time. He saw the dog, saw the frantic parents, and saw the muddy streaks on the glass. His face hardened. Mrs. Smith, I apologize for this breach. That dog needs to be put down. This is clearly an obsession. He snatched a rag from his pocket and wiped the glass clean, erasing the vital pattern with a single, careless swipe. Willie whined in protest, but it was too late. The physical map was gone, but the image was already seared into Catherine's mind. They tried to explain the pattern to Jeremy, but he dismissed it instantly. It's a K9 hallucination, fueled by stress. You need to let us handle this. As Jeremy dragged Willie back toward the police vehicle, the dog strained, looking over his shoulder at Catherine, his eyes begging her to remember the pattern and act before it was too late. The tension in the house that night was a living, suffocating thing. Jeremy's brusque dismissal had reignited Donald's certainty that the dog was a danger, but it had only solidified Catherine's conviction that Willie was the only hope. Outside, the weather mirrored their inner chaos. A violent, massive thunderstorm rolled in. Wind howled through the eaves, rattling the window panes, and lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the front yard in harsh, stuttering pulses. Donald insisted they try to sleep, but Catherine paced, the image of the 2-to-1 pattern flashing behind her eyes with every lightning strike. Then, cutting through the drumming rain and the peals of thunder, came a sound that froze them both, not tapping, but a mournful, urgent howl. Willie was back, standing in the torrential downpour, his head tilted back, issuing a long, primal cry that spoke of warning and absolute despair. This was no longer a nightly ritual. This was a signal of immediate, desperate urgency. The storm had forced Willie's hand, and now it was forcing theirs. Donald finally broke. He looked at his wife, then at the frantic dog illuminated by a flash of lightning, and the last vestiges of his rational disbelief crumbled. "He's not stressed, Catherine. He's terrified. Something is happening now." The howling stopped as Willie ran to the edge of the woods, looked back, and ran in a short, deliberate pattern. 2 steps left, then 1 right, repeating the 2-to-1 sequence before vanishing into the dense, black thicket. "That's it. That's the map." Catherine gasped. 2 left, 1 right. "We have to go." They scrambled, grabbing heavy flashlights and rain jackets. They knew the police would never sanction this, especially not in the middle of a storm, and they knew Officer Jeremy would soon realize Willie had escaped the precinct again. They tore open the front door just as they heard the faint wail of a distant siren. Jeremy was on his way. They ignored it, plunging into the blinding storm, following the last place they had seen the dog vanish. The chase was immediate, dark, and utterly treacherous. The ground was slick mud, and the wind whipped branches against their faces. Willie, even in the heavy rain, was waiting just inside the tree line, his eyes glowing in the beam of their flashlights. He barked once, a short, encouraging sound, before launching himself into a desperate run. He didn't just run blindly, he would stop every few yards, looking back, making sure they correctly followed the non-human map in the chaotic darkness, guiding them deeper and deeper into the unsearched perimeter of the woods, deliberately avoiding the main search grids where the scent had first died. They were entirely alone, relying on nothing but the desperate instinct of a police dog. The pursuit through the woods was brutal. Rain slicked the forest floor, turning every step into a slippery battle. Donald, fueled by adrenaline, focused on keeping the beam of his flashlight on Willie's tactical vest, a tiny beacon of hope moving through the impenetrable darkness. Catherine stumbled, her ankle twisting in a concealed root, but Donald hauled her up, whispering, "Keep moving, Kath. He knows." They pushed past thorny thickets and dense foliage, the cold rain soaking them to the bone. They were far beyond the neighborhood now, in a desolate, forgotten section of the woods that the official search teams had deemed impassable. Willie never faltered, constantly executing the directional signal, running 2 lengths to the left, then 1 length sharp to the right, precisely following the 2-to-1 pattern he had drawn on the glass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of desperate running, Willie came to an abrupt stop. He was standing in a small, obscured clearing, frantically sniffing a barely visible mound of earth covered in old, moss-laden planks and dead vines. It was expertly camouflaged, completely invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The smell of damp, stale earth and something faintly chemical hung heavy in the air. Willie began to dig furiously, scratching and tearing at the vines until Donald shouted, "Stop, boy. I see it." The mound was clearly a hidden trapdoor, sealed by a crude, heavy metal latch partially covered by dirt. Donald dropped to his knees, his heart hammering against his ribs. Using a fallen branch as a lever, he strained against the rusty lock. With a horrible metallic groan and the sound of cracking wood, the latch gave way. Donald threw the camouflaged door back. A dark, cold plume of air, smelling of deep earth and fear, wafted up. They stared down into the black hole, a shaft leading to a cramped, earthen chamber below. It was impossible to see anything, but the air was heavy with the presence of something hidden and terrible. Then, cutting through the silence and the receding thunder, came a sound so faint, so fragile, that Catherine almost missed it. Tap tap tap. A tiny, rhythmic sound from the abyss below. Catherine's breath hitched, a choked sound caught in her throat. The shoe tap, she whispered, tears finally returning, but these were tears of revelation, not grief. Kimberly always tapped her shoe in a specific rhythm when she was scared, a small, nervous habit. It was the sound of her daughter, alive. Donald grabbed his flashlight, shone the beam down into the narrow shaft, and descended without a word. Catherine followed, her mind already consumed by the horrifying realization of who must have put their daughter down here. Willie, the loyal guard, positioned himself directly by the open trapdoor, his body tense, ready to defend the entrance. The chamber below was small, filthy, and cold, smelling of mildew and stagnant air. The flashlight beam revealed a figure huddled in the corner, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. Kimberly. She was pale, frail, and wide-eyed with terror, but she was alive. The reunion was silent, devastating, and immediate. Catherine gathered her daughter into a desperate hug, sobbing into her hair, while Donald knelt beside them, shielding them both. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical pain. "Mommy, Daddy," Kimberly whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I was so scared. The man, he said I had to be quiet." She paused, then her eyes darted toward the entrance, growing wide with fresh terror. "He's coming back. He said he was going to feed me now. And I wasn't alone, Daddy. I heard someone else crying in the next room." Before Donald could process the revelation of a second victim, a low, guttural growl ripped through the tense silence from the shaft above. Willie. The dog, standing guard at the entrance, had sensed the imminent return of the abductor. His posture was rigid, his fur bristling, and his growl was no longer one of desperation, but a terrifying, controlled wariness. "Wani," Donald whispered, confirming the identity of the monster who had taken their child. A moment later, the light was extinguished as a heavy shadow blocked the opening. Killer Wani was here. He descended into the chamber, a hulking figure holding a burlap sack. He paused, shocked to find the parents and the dog already there. How did you find this place?" Wani roared, dropping the sack and reaching for a weapon concealed at his waist. Donald shoved Catherine and Kimberly into the farthest corner. Willie didn't wait for a command. The K-9 training, honed over years, took over instantly. With a terrifying snarl that shook the underground space, the large German shepherd launched himself down the shaft. He slammed into Killer Wani with the force of a battering ram, the heavy tactical vest protecting him as he drove the criminal into the muddy wall. Willie locked his jaws onto Wani's arm, maintaining a controlled but crushing grip, pinning the killer against the stone. The sheer, overwhelming power of the K-9 prevented Wani from reaching his weapon. Just as Wani thrashed violently, trying to shake the dog, the sound of sirens and heavy running feet echoed from the clearing above. Officer Jeremy, having followed the trail of his desperate dog in the massive storm, had arrived with backup. "Police! Freeze! Drop the weapon!" Jeremy shouted into the shaft. Wani slumped, defeated, pinned by the unrelenting hero. Jeremy and the backup officers rapidly secured the entrance and descended, arresting Killer Wani and confirming the presence of a second, terrified child in an adjoining space. The nightmare was over, ended not by human intellect or official channels, but by the relentless loyalty and unconventional communication of one police dog. The chaos of the arrest gave way to the quiet urgency of the rescue. The storm had finally broken, and the first rays of a pale, hesitant dawn broke through the clouds, casting a sliver of weak light onto the damp clearing. Kimberly was the first to be lifted out of the filthy chamber, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, pale but miraculously safe. Donald and Catherine immediately enveloped her, a wordless, desperate embrace that contained all the fear, grief, and overwhelming relief of the past week. Officer Jeremy, his face streaked with mud and tears, stood over the subdued figure of Killer Wani. He looked from the criminal to the exhausted dog, the shock and disbelief finally giving way to profound, humbling respect. The police, the protocol, the tracking technology, all had failed. The only thing that had worked was the dog's refusal to give up and Catherine's courage to trust a muddy paw print. Catherine gently handed Kimberly to Donald and knelt beside Willie, who was panting heavily, his muscles trembling from the controlled exertion of the takedown. His tactical vest was ripped, his fur soaked and matted with mud, but his eyes were clear. She stroked his broad head, tracing the edge of his ear with a trembling finger. "You did it, Willie," she whispered, tears of pure joy running down her cheeks. "You saved her, boy. You are our hero." Willie leaned into her touch, finally allowing his body to relax. He closed his eyes and let out a deep, satisfied exhale, a sound of immense relief, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment Kimberly had first vanished. Paramedics checked Kimberly and the second child, confirming they were physically unharmed but traumatized. Reporters, drawn by the sudden flurry of police activity, soon descended on the clearing, turning the small spot of earth into a chaotic scene. As the officers prepared to lead the exhausted dog back to the precinct for veterinary care, Willie paused. He turned his head and looked back at Kimberly one last time. Kimberly, clutched tightly in her father's arms, lifted her small, pale hand and gave the dog a tiny, brave wave. The sight cemented the true meaning of the week's events for Catherine. The tap on the window wasn't just a clue, it was an oath. Willie had seen the trail die, but he had refused to accept failure. He had bypassed the system, risked his career, and communicated a secret to the only person desperate enough to listen. Donald wrapped his arms around his family, looking at the dog with unending gratitude. Willie's tail gave a final, gentle thump against the mud. His mission was complete, justice was served, and the aggressive K-9 who nobody could calm had earned his title as the focused hero the Smith family would never forget.